So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kernan Webb. I am a professor in the Law and Business Department at Toronto Metropolitan University and also the director of the Toronto Metropolitan University Institute for the Study of Corporate Social Responsibility. And it is in that latter capacity that I'm very pleased to be in a conversation today with returning favorite guest, Bennett Freeman, to talk about a recurring topic, although we are approaching it regularly from different angles, and that is global multi-stakeholder initiatives and coalitions. Where have we been? Where are we going? What can we learn from that? And just a note that all of these sessions are undertaken in the spirit of constructive engagement. What can we learn? In particular, zeroing in on the role of the private sector, the role of the market. How can we make that the most constructive and positive impact as possible? Next slide, please. Toronto Metropolitan University is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Next slide, please. All TMU CSR Institute sessions are animated by this definition of social responsibility, which was the product of a global multi-stakeholder process, bringing together governments, intergovernmental bodies, businesses, civil society organizations from developed countries, from developing countries. The standard is more than 100 pages long, but this is the definition of social responsibility that continues to animate all of our work. And basically, the point is, it is all about transparency in all decision-making and action, behaving in an ethical way, contributing to the health and welfare of society and sustainable development, taking into account not only the expectations of shareholders, but also all stakeholders, consumers, businesses, workers, communities, governments, investors, you name it, is in compliance with applicable law. But yes, not just applicable law, also international norms of behavior, which often ultimately crystallize into domestic laws of one sort or another, but play a very formative role as international norms of behavior, of which, again, many of which we'll be talking about here today. And it's not just about how businesses and other organizations integrate it within their organizations, but it is also about how it is practiced in their relationships with others. So again, whether that's workers, consumers, human rights defenders, you name it, the full range of entities with which and individuals with which an organization interacts, as the case might be. Next slide, please. The second animating concept for all of these sessions is the concept of sustainable governance, which basically recognizes that in 2026 and going forward, we're just not going to be able to solve our problems by looking to government or intergovernmental bodies. They continue to play an absolutely central role. But these days, we need to be, and we are increasingly, looking to what can the private sector bring to the table and what can civil society bring to the table. And sometimes it is business that leads. Sometimes it is civil society that leads. Sometimes it is government that leads or intergovernmental bodies that lead. Sometimes it's collaboration. Sometimes it's more of a rivalrous dynamic. But we just need to recognize that governance in 2026 and going forward is typically a multi-splendored thing with many delightful combinations, permutations, and so on. Next slide, please. And related to that, when I talk about institutions within sustainable governance, what I mean is specialized entities that are carrying out particular public interest, public oriented functions of one sort or another, whether that's rulemaking. Rulemaking with governments is law. Rulemakings at the intergovernmental level is treaties, declarations, and so on, and principles, guidelines, and so on, compacts. But there's also a lot of rulemaking that goes on in institutions that are not governmental at all. For example, ISO has got its own institution for rulemaking, and so on and so forth. And then there's a tremendous diversity of rule instruments that are out there, from the legal ones that everybody knows about, but through a lot of different other things, standards, codes, guidelines, principles, benchmarks, you name it, but they're all rule instruments. And they are all the product of a process, a rulemaking process, but then they ultimately are implemented through a diversity of processes. Again, with government, we're familiar with inspections leading to prosecutions and enforcement actions and so on. But when we talk about moving outside of state apparatus, then we're talking about certifications and various other techniques that are used to ensure compliance and to deal with dispute resolution. So it doesn't have to go through a court in order for there to be dispute resolution. And then there's a wide diversity of actors involved in all respects. So that's all background, and a very good background to what we're going to be talking about here today. Next slide, please. So just to let you know that we have these sessions all the time. Some of you, this might be your first time at one of these sessions. If that's the case, welcome. If you're a return guest, welcome back. We have another one coming up, really interesting one coming up with Amy Boulanger from the Assurance for Initiative for Responsible Mining. And that initiative is one which has continued to evolve and become actually a more powerful and high profile entity for doing mining assurance, responsible mining assurance, as time has gone on. And the whole story of how it developed, how it has evolved, challenges, and so on, that will be an upcoming session on July the 6th. So stay tuned for more information about that. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background leading up to this particular session here with Bennett. Bennett and I have been working together on any number of different projects over the years. And Bennett represents a deep well of experience, frontline experience, where he has been right there, the guy or one of the guys who said, hey, maybe what we should do is X or Y or Z. And there's been a lot of X, Ys, and Zs over the years. And it's why he's really, I cannot think of a better person to basically give us some insights concerning what's worked, what hasn't worked, ways of resolving issues. And then, of course, what's different about 2026. And as Bennett and I were talking about just yesterday, there's a lot different about 2026. What I was saying is that little did we realize from the 1990s through to now that in a large respect, we had the wind behind us and we were going on a downhill incline. As a cyclist, you're always looking for a downhill incline because things are so much easier when you're biking downhill and the wind is behind you. And you only realize it when the wind is in your face and you're biking uphill. And what I was saying to Bennett is that we didn't realize that we actually had a lot of momentum behind us when we were involved in all of these initiatives through the 90s up until now. But now we realize we're biking into the wind and uphill. And so those operating conditions are very, very important to understand when we're talking about what will work in 2026 that perhaps we didn't need to be so concerned about in previous years when we did have the wind at our backs and we did have a nice downward grade that we were biking on. So specifically Bennett and I have been knocking our head against the wall trying to get a global um, rule of law, multi-stakeholder coalition in place. And it's been really damn difficult, if I can be entirely blunt. And it's been really, really difficult because a lot of parties who up until now would have been absolute slam dunks. They would have either put their hands up of their own initiative, or with a tiny bit of prompting, they would have said, sure, we'll be involved in that. And we don't mind saying that we're involved in that. But this is 2026, and that is no longer the case. Now there's a great deal of ducking and covering going on. And we want to talk, Bennett and I, we want to talk about a lot of these really fantastic initiatives that Bennett has been right there at the front leadership role playing in it, and learning from that. But we also want to circle back to what's going to work today in 2026. I'm not sure, Bennett, that you're particularly aware of the work that I've been doing on the Middle Power Alliance, but prior to Prime Minister Carney suggesting, hey, why don't middle powers get together? I had written an article saying exactly that. Hey, why don't middle powers get together? I'm glad that Prime Minister Carney said what he did, and that there's been, traction with respect to that. Although I'm taking it a step further now, so stay tuned for the article coming out, which is going to say that we need to have a home, as Virginia Woolf would say, we need a room of our own for middle powers. But what I really would like to kind of ultimately circle back to with Bennett is this, whether we're talking about middle powers getting together, or we're talking about a global multi-stakeholder coalition or alliance or initiative concerning the rule of law, one way or the other, we've got to figure out how to do that when we have a prevailing northerly wind blowing right in our face, and it is pushing, and it is pushing hard. So Bennett indicated to me, and I like it right off the bat, that we need to make a distinction between initiatives and coalitions. And so this is what we've said there. And you'll see mention of several things: voluntary principles on security and human rights. That's one of the ones where Bennett played a lead role on that. And the Cotton Campaign and Be for Ukraine are two other initiatives that are coalitions, I guess you could say, that Bennett's been involved in. So we will definitely be making that distinction. There's some others. What's the difference between those and a movement, for example? What's the difference between an initiative, a coalition, a movement, and a standard, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of definitional issues that we need to address. But next slide, please. So very briefly, with respect to Bennett, as you can see here, and as you could see in the announcement for it, Bennett has been a very powerful, needed, catalytic force going back to the 90s when he was in the Clinton administration, and he had the backing of the US government when he was doing things, through to when he no longer had that backing, and he was with Calvert, an investment firm. And so he was speaking from that perspective, but that's another great backer, is to have the investment community backing you. And then he's been involved in so many other different initiatives over the years here, in so many different capacities. I've tried to just bold a few of them here in this slide, so that we try to remember to at least touch on some of these, Bennett, in our conversation. But enough of that. Let's begin. One more slide, please. Just to say that wherever you are, we welcome your comments. Email me. I'll be tracking that, and I'll try to fold your questions and comments into the discussion that we are about to have. So, Bennett, apologies for that bit of a long opening session, but it's done. It's over. Let's begin. Maybe you could just say a little bit about, prior to Clinton, how is it that you came to be uh, involved in the Clinton administration, and maybe even much earlier, when you said to yourself as a child in a sandbox, looking up at mom and dad, and you said, "Mom, Dad, when I grow up, I want to I want to be one of the principal initiators of the voluntary principles for security and human rights." So what was the kind
Good
of
thing.
the genesis story, the origin story of
Oh
Bennett?
gosh, Kurt, thank you. Thanks for the really great overview introduction of our themes, and thanks for the overly generous introduction of me, and I appreciate it. And we first met in 2018 when you had me up in Toronto to give a talk, and we've been at it together ever since. So I've appreciated your friendship and our work together, and we've got much more to do, as we'll be talking about the next hour. So, I just on the personal note, quickly before we get into the substantive themes here. I'm of a certain age and generation from a certain place that fundamentally shaped my view of the world and I guess my aspirations. I grew up in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s, did my first degree at Berkeley in the mid to late 70s. Berkeley then still looked like the 60s, even if the politics had moved on. But many of us, whether in the US or Canada or Europe or elsewhere around the world, whose childhood and youth took place against the backdrop of the 60s and 70s, were really inspired to get into what I loosely call, and I hope not to fancifully, the change the world business. That we were imbued with the idealism that we observed if we didn't participate directly in it as kids, then as students. And in my case, I wanted to be in politics, government, international affairs in ways I didn't think too hard about the exact forms or shapes those would take. But I've been fortunate to have a interesting career in politics and government, in the corporate world, the investment world, and the NGO advocacy world, sort of all blended together. But I started my career helping former U.S. Vice President Walter Mondale lose 49 states to Ronald Reagan. That was a noble, if failed, campaign, but a wonderful one that taught me much of what I've hope I learned over the years. And then I did something that for 8 years during the second Reagan administration and the first George Bush administration, 85 to 92. Bizarrely, given frankly my political views and background, I ended up getting headhunted and hired by the then emerging most powerful, famous CEO in corporate America, Jack Welch at GE, who in the 80s and 90s was sort of the Bill Gates and Steve Jobs rolled together in terms of his power and prestige in corporate America. And he gave me a chance to be speechwriter, aide de camp, policy advisor. And I ended up staying 8 years working more directly with the executive vice president of the company of GE, which at the time was 1% of US GDP and unsurpassed in its prestige and power in corporate America, if not among all global multinational corporations. So I really had an apprenticeship in the belly of the beast of corporate America to see what somebody with my values and views might be able to do and find some points of alignment. And that was a real crucial education for what I've hoped to have done, tried to do the last 25 years or so, which is to find points of alignment with people who may not share values but may share some interests, and to try to bring together business, particularly big multinational corporations, together with governments, international institutions, international NGOs, local civil society, in my case, human rights defenders, and also investors. But I don't think I would have had the moxie or the mojo, even with the convening power of the US government, with the State Department, to have convened the biggest US and UK oil and mining companies with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other NGOs in calendar year 2000 to put together the global human rights standard for oil and mining. Had I not had that education at GE in that belly of the beast of corporate America of how one can learn from and find ways to engage even from a different ideological and cultural and generational perspective with a huge company. So that was critical for me in terms of what I learned and was then later able to apply.
Bennett, but just quickly on that point, whatever we want to say about Jack Welch and about GE, he wasn't looking for a yes man from you, was he? He was looking for somebody who could challenge him, right?
That's right.
That's an indication of
That's
how
right.
different things are now,
Yeah,
where
that's exactly right. And, I came to that interview a couple of weeks or a month or so after he was on the cover of Fortune magazine as the toughest boss in America. And I read in that profile, he liked an argument, he liked a challenge, he didn't like yes people. So the entire interview, almost the entire interview, one-on-one in January of 1985 was an argument
yeah,
about
yeah,
nuclear power and South Africa divestment. I
yeah.
was respectful, but stuck to my views, and he sure as hell stuck to his, and offered me the job a week later. And I thought, what the hell? I need a job. I can learn something. I can contribute, but I'm going to try to remain who I am. But I'll have a larger view of the world and how power is exercised. So it was very worthwhile for me.
I bring that up because here we are in 2026. That's not how it's done, apparently, in the United States at the highest levels. You just hire people who entirely agree with you and who will enable you, right? It's a completely different view of how power should be exercised. You don't want to have anyone around you who could possibly challenge you. You just want yes people around you. So we don't need to spend any more time on that. It was a different era. Yep.
Yep. Indeed. One thing I was a sentence of yours in particular I just want to pick up on as a way to get into the broader themes here, Kernahan, and your excellent overview is this notion that we can't solve all of our problems by looking to government. And that is such a critically important fundamental point that became really increasingly apparent in the mid to late 1990s and led to extraordinary run of aspiration, creativity, and impact. Inconsistent, incomplete, inadequate in many ways, but nonetheless really positive and significant of bringing together different actors, different sectors, again, who may not have shared all the same values, but at least were willing to try to find some converging, if not fully common interests. And what really enabled that, I think, is putting my former history student, still history student hat on, is that we had some, hugely significant epic developments in the 1990s. We had the end of the Cold War. We had the emergence of global civil society. We had the advent of the World Wide Web building on the previously created internet that connected the world in ways that had never been seen or really conceived except in science fiction. Global issues became local more than ever. Local issues became global more than ever. And the climate agenda, the climate crisis became apparent. Human rights abuses, labor rights abuses, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, while all present for millennia, became better documented. And you had this emergence of NGOs, many of whom had been around for a long time. Oxfam since 1944 during World War II, Amnesty International since 1961, newer ones like Global Witness since only 1995. I mentioned three that I've been very involved with over the years, but the point is that they all became hyper empowered in the mid to late 90s. Globalization was accelerating multinational corporations, which had been controversial for decades. I remember as a student at Berkeley in the mid to late 70s, the rap against the evil multinational corporations. But what changed in the mid to late 90s was not just the acceleration of globalization, but the backlash against it. And the sense, which I credit some in the corporate world, of understanding that if they wanted to sustain or build any kind of support for globalization, that they would need to engage with critics. They would need to actually look at issues like climate and human rights. And it was that insight on the part of a few corporate leaders. Neil Fitzgerald, I recall from Unilever in the late 90s, early 2000s. John Brown, later Lord Brown, who I met and worked a little bit with, a lot with BP back in the day, had this insight as well. And I don't want to give them too much credit. I mean, globalization was fatally undermined by the tolerance and, frankly, the perpetuation of entrenched inequality. We saw the chickens come home to roost in the financial crisis of 2008, the job insecurity, economic dislocation that we've seen in the UK, leading to Brexit, the US, frankly, leading to populism, nationalism, and I'll just say it, Trump, reverberations across Europe and around the world. So I don't want to, look back at this as any kind of golden era. It wasn't. But the point is that we had huge historical forces that converged in the mid to late 90s that set the stage for efforts, some successful, some failed, so some the jury is still out on, to try to actually set standards and build coalitions across stakeholders. And we weren't even using stakeholder language really until the late 90s, early 2000s, really the late 90s, even though the word had been invented and was in, obscure circulation a couple decades earlier. So let me just stop there, but I just
Mhm.
wanted to point out this key point that, you know, governments remain first and foremost, and people like me who believe in democratic, small d, and in my case as an American, I'll just say it, big D, democratic governance, but with respect for parties of the center right, not just center left. I'm a government first guy, but we've never been able to and will never be able to solve all of our problems or even begin to address them without working across sectors, governments, international institutions, civil society, NGOs, the whole combination of sectors and actors. That's how the world has evolved since the 90s. There's no going back.
Great sort of summary at a very super high level, selective, admittedly, and you're not denying that. Couple of points though. One, you didn't mention, but it's critically important, is the global anti-apartheid movement, which required pushing from everybody, from intergovernmental, from government, from the private sector, from civil society. And it was largely done in an era prior to the internet, which is even more impressive. In hindsight now, a simpler time. But at any rate, it was a successful global multi-stakeholder initiative, and it was effectively about the rule of law at the end of the day. So that's point number one. Point number two is, yes, the advent of the internet and the web. And what happened with that was that the previously somewhat to largely handcuffed civil society organizations, suddenly the transaction costs for them organizing, for them communicating and disseminating their views were immensely reduced. And so suddenly they could be a much more even player with business and with government. And so you had things like the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, which started off as an attempt to get an international treaty on clear-cut forests, largely focusing on the equator regions. But when that didn't work, when there wasn't support from governments, intergovernmental processes, several of the major environmental organizations said, well, what about us coming together and producing a certification standard, which they did, and which, that was not their first choice either. But they did that, and that became a highly successful, to this day, certification standard that many of the world's forestry companies are all getting certified to. Not suggesting it is perfect either. So intergovernmental bodies, not perfect, but they have an incredibly important role. Governments, not perfect, they've got an incredible central role. Private sector, not perfect, but they've got an important role. Civil society, not perfect, but playing an important role. So I just wanted to kind of, as we get into the late 90s and you start to particularly explore with success a variety of different initiatives, to me, that's the backdrop.
Yep, that's right. I think that's exactly right. And I just want to pick up on this theme, Kernahan, of imperfection and improvisation. We do what we can when we can with the tools and resources we have against the backdrop of the domestic politics and geopolitics that we have or don't have. And that was the case when, for me, when in 1999, when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, I had this idea that there was a big problem for U.S. and, for that matter, other global oil and mining companies of how they operate in tough places with violent conflicts on the ground and community unrest. And I was thinking particularly of the Niger Delta in Nigeria with Chevron and Exxon, plus, of course, Shell. I was thinking about Indonesia during the Civil War in Aceh and the continuing unrest to this day in West Papua and with Exxon, with the Mobil later merged with Exxon. I was thinking about Colombia during the Civil War, BP accused, I think correctly, of employing right-wing paramilitaries to provide security who in turn committed human rights abuses. And the question is, what could we do? And we couldn't really, despite having a Democratic president, we couldn't really legislate extraterritorial laws that would require assent of host country governments in other countries that would be imposed on companies not just based in the U.S. and elsewhere. And so I had this idea that, we could try to come up with some kind of a voluntary multi-stakeholder standard for which there was really little precedent, really only with the Fair Labor Association, which also had emerged in the Clinton administration a couple of years earlier in the mid 90s. But the point is that, it would have been nice to have gotten the whole world together in Geneva or New York or Johannesburg or somewhere else, and put something together that would have been legally binding, but that wasn't possible, legally, politically, or logistically. So we did what we could. I pulled together the biggest U.S. and UK oil and mining companies, with the exception at the time of Exxon that came in a couple years later. And I basically, as the U.S. government, couldn't have done it without the U.S. government. I was representing the U.S. government, but I was basically the bartender at the original Star Wars bar scene. I mean, to pull Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and International Alert into the same room with Chevron and BP and Shell and Rio Tinto and Freeport McMoran and Conoco. I mean, these weren't people from different planets in the same solar system. These were aliens from different galaxies. And I really actually felt that I was the bartender serving drinks at the original Star Wars bar scene, just to get people to talk and to recognize that even if they didn't have common values, that they did have some converging interests. And the breakthrough for us that created the voluntary principles was to get the NGOs to acknowledge that the companies had legitimate security needs and therefore need to work with military, police, and private security. And the corollary breakthrough was for the companies to recognize that they faced human rights risks and in turn had human rights responsibilities that they had to face up to and to work with civil society, international NGOs, local communities to respect human rights. And once those bottom lines from each side were understood, acknowledged, and respected, I knew that we could get to yes, even serving drinks in the original Star Wars bar scene. And it was hard. None of this is easy, but we did it in 1 year once we had that critical breakthrough. But we do what we can when we can. At the same time, the late Professor David Weisbrot, then a professor at the University of Minnesota, was leading an effort under the UN umbrella of trying to create so-called norms for multinational enterprises on human rights. That effort failed for all kinds of political reasons. The companies wouldn't play. The NGOs were probably pushing too hard, too fast, even if people like me agreed with them. The effort collapsed, but out of it came the mandate beginning in 2005, given to John Ruggie, who over the course of 3-year mandates produced the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Some in the NGO world remain unsatisfied that the floor is too high and the ceiling too low, and want to keep pushing. And there's still discussions and negotiations in Geneva around a binding treaty, which is a perfectly legitimate exercise. But he did what he could with engagement of companies, with investors and NGOs and governments around the world, and produced the guiding principles. They're not legally binding, but they have assumed soft law status. They are the international standard for companies across the board on human rights, just as the voluntary principles of security and human rights are the global human rights standard for oil and mining. Again, we do what we can when we can with what we have. We evolve towards regulation, towards law, but it's piecemeal, incremental, step by step. Not good enough for some, but a hell of a lot better than nothing.
Absolutely. Couple points is number one is that there was a willingness by government, private sector, and civil society to try to find common ground
Yeah,
at that time. Now what we're seeing is polarization, incredible polarization, weaponization. It's not possible now in the United States for anybody on the ruling side to make any sort of a comment about the other side without saying the corrupt Biden, da 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 da. They have to add several polarizing, that was the worst, da 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 da, and we're the best, and so there's polarization now on social media, which is an offspring of the internet that led to these great things, such as, I would suggest, great things such as civil society now having a much greater ability to communicate, to organize, and so on. But now we have, on top of that, we do have this polarization and weaponization. You can't say anything without someone who really has no desire whatsoever to work with you. Their desire is to bring you down, to bring you all down, use disinformation, use misinformation, and so on, and to cloud the picture. What's that? Flooding the zone and all that sort of stuff here. So I get it that was definitely the case. There was a willingness then. That situation has changed, and I don't want to get there now, but I want to put a big asterisk on. That's what I was talking about with the wind, and the incline was in our favor back then,
yeah,
and it is no longer there.
yeah,
And I'm not sure how to get out of that. But the other point to make is that the United States has not been afraid to do extraterritorial laws and
yeah,
everything else whenever they felt like it in the past. But an interesting one is the story of bribery and anti-corruption, right? Where you did have the United States, first of all, United States companies caught engaging in corruption around the world, leading to the FCPA, which Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, which was ultimately reaching across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans saying, this is not good, this is not acceptable for American corporations to do that. But then American corporations realizing, you know what, we put ourselves up at a disadvantage competitively if everybody else doesn't also have basically the same thing as the FCPA. We're now at a disadvantage. And so United States led the charge to have an international treaty and several that flowed from that on bribery and corruption. So it was a rare situation where
Yeah.
United States actually led the charge.
Yeah.
I would say because they made a mistake, strategic or tactical mistake with the FCPA because they didn't realize, oh my God, we're
Yeah.
putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. But at
Yeah.
any rate,
Yeah.
at that time, 1999 was when these international treaties on bribery and corruption also started to come out. So you just think of that convergence of all
Yeah.
of those things just at the time that you were working on the voluntary principles
Yeah.
on business and human
Gosh,
rights.
it's amazing you mentioned that. We hadn't talked about this. I've got a little personal footnote on this. So,
Good.
look, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was a landmark in U.S. law, but really in global standard setting, and was a direct response to the Lockheed and other scandals in the mid 1970s. So, fast forward 1993, I was chief speechwriter for Secretary of State Christopher, 93 through 96, and was assigned the task of writing his first speech to the American business audience in October of 93. And I'd just been at GE for 8 years. And I didn't call him up for advice, but I learned the corruption issue there. GE was getting beaten out of $500 million contracts, and 500 million was a lot of money in the late 80s, early 90s. $500 million contracts in India, Indonesia, other countries by British, French,
Yeah,
German,
yeah,
Japanese companies who were bribing, and GE was bound by the Foreign Corrupt
yeah,
Practices Act.
yeah,
So the light bulb went on over my head, pardon the GE pun, but the light bulb went on over my head that we should propose a negotiation of international illicit payments bribery standard through the OECD, that would probably be the most accessible platform or institution. And I don't remember if that idea was out there circulating or whether it just occurred to me. It was frankly obvious. And I wrote it, got it cleared, 2 paragraphs. He proposed it. And bang, I was with him at the OECD ministerial in June of 1994 when it was actually agreed.
yeah,
So I learned the issue
yeah,
in the private sector. Now, we could come up with 1,001 examples of corporate interests that we may not like or agree with that then get legislated. I could come up with more than 1,001, but this is an example, I think, of how we try to think creatively and constructively. I have 1,000% certainty that had I not thought of it in October '93 and put it in the speech, and that it still would have happened. It may have happened, 6 months or 18 months later. The time had come,
mm-hmm,
So the
mm-hmm.
story isn't about me. It just happens that I did have the pen in hand that got that rolling. I had nothing to do with negotiating it. It would have certainly happened without that speech, but maybe a couple years later. But bang, there we go. Um,
Yeah,
and that helped level the whole point competitively. It wasn't just an ethical matter. It was about leveling the playing field
totally.
for American companies. So we do
Yes.
what we do through a combination of values and interests. And I'm totally values driven in what I care about in the world and what I've tried to do in my career. But what I learned early on in my GE incarnation is that those of us who are values driven have to find points of convergence with hard interests, whether
Yeah,
it's with corporate interests, American foreign policy, or national security interests. And I sold internally what became the voluntary principles on security and human rights on the grounds that it is the U.S. foreign policy, national security, and energy security interests for our companies to be able to operate in tough places with rules of the road to navigate the toughest human rights issues, which are operationally, ethically, and reputationally killers if you mishandle them, as Shell found to its great regret in the 90s in Nigeria. So this is just such a critically important point. The sweet spot is finding the points of convergence between values and interests,
yeah.
in my view, in my experience.
Well, and what I was thinking about was bobbing and weaving. Muhammad Ali, bobbing and weaving, rope-a-doping. Making it to the 15th round. All that is true, but I just want to add in, it's no longer about bobbing and weaving. Now we're in mixed martial arts, right? Now it's kicking. and
Kickboxing.
strangling and choking. And,
Yeah.
so the whole the whole level of interaction has become a much more aggressive. It's a tougher neighborhood now. You still have to do exactly what you were doing then, which is find the common ground and argue it on the basis of, look, this is good for you. This is
Yeah.
good for you financially. It also happens to be good in terms of values, but I'm not going to peddle the values with you because I know with you it's all about interest. That's what I'll peddle to you. But over to you over here on the other side, I'll be peddling the values side. Whatever works, right? To get
Right.
to that common ground. But again, I just come back to the neighborhood and the way of interacting today in 2026. It's a much tougher
Much,
neighborhood than it ever
much
was back
tougher.
then.
And it's our politics, I'll just say it, have been poisoned by the poison on social media. They've been poisoned on the demonization of political opponents. We've gone from respectful adversaries to,
Enemies.
calling out enemies.
Yeah.
And it's horrifying. And it's particularly horrifying for Americans as we're now in the 250th year, the anniversary of our great Declaration of Independence. And we have so much repair to do. I think maybe the most fundamental repair, which in my less optimistic moments as an eternal optimist, but my realistic, pessimistic moments, I despair of how we're going to get back to basic agreement on how we define truth and fact. There's nothing more fundamental to our interactions as human beings, as countries, as cultures, as communities, as different sectors. The late, great US Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said 25 or 30 years ago to an opponent, political opponent, adversary, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. We've lost that. And
We
how
have.
now with the AI overlay on top of the social media, the poison dimensions of social media. Not that it's all bad, far from it, but there are parts of it that are poisoned. How do we get back to fact and truth? And the current administration in the U.S., I'm sorry to say, is not helping. And whether it's
To
the
say the least.
analogy and the reflecting pool as a metaphor or otherwise, the denial of some of those realities tells us where we are. And I just think that in our personal and family and community interactions, in our educational institutions, that in our professional interactions, let alone political, that there's no more important or difficult, daunting task than recovering a agreed sense of how we define truth and fact while respecting different views and frankly different values underpinning different views. Liberal democracy uh, fails without a degree of respect, and we've lost that mutual respect for now, and God help us if we don't recover it.
This actually nicely dovetails with something that I really think is worth exploring, and that's the concept of responsible communication. So it really relates directly to this. We're now in an age of polarization, uh, malinformation, disinformation, and so on. And you're right. If we cannot agree that this is the facts and this is just your opinion, which is unfortunately purposely right now, purposely that's what's going on by I'm sad to say, leading the charge is President Trump himself, with his, you know, I bet you laughed as I did when he first said fake news. But he's been successful in absolutely flipping the uh, the opponent in terms of now there's absolutely no line between fake news and real news. He's leading the charge. He's leading the charge in creating the fake news. So um, the concept of responsible communication, here's what I'm thinking of. Um, it would seem to me that finding common ground, whether you are in government maybe not the US government, federal government, but whether you are in government or you are in private sector or you in civil society, one thing we can all agree is the value of responsible communication. And
Yep.
responsible communication means before you say something, you check to make sure that it is accurate, you provide your sources, and you are willing to sort of say, here's
Yep.
what the other side says. I'm going to give space to the other side. And
Yep.
now here's our response to that.
Right.
So if we had a standard on responsible communication backed up by laws, defamation laws, and so on, but if we had a standard on responsible communication that then companies and non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and governments could basically align themselves with, commit themselves to, and say, we're doing this, and make that clear on any communication. We are adhering to the responsible communication
Yep.
set of criteria here. Um, You'd be able to isolate out the
Yeah.
actors who will not sign on to that. They won't
Right.
sign on to that. And so basically, if you're not signing on to it, that means you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
You're one of the ones that's
Yes.
engaging in the misinformation, the disinformation, and so on. And everybody else, the only things we're going to say are things that we can back up, we can support, we can
Mhm.
substantiate, and we recognize that there is another side, and here is the other side, and here's our response to that other side.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a little bit like the rule of law, which I would have thought was a slam dunk. Every organization, every government, every private sector organization would sign on and say, yeah, above we may have our disagreements, but we all agree on the rule of law as fundamental to all of our best interests. But that hasn't worked out. So
Right.
I just want to throw that out here because I do
Yeah.
think that the misinformation and disinformation
Yep.
and the fake news and the pollution, the polarization prevents finding common ground, right?
Right.
Because you don't know whether or not you're speaking to someone who's actually providing you with their real position on it, or whether or not that is produced by AI or what have you.
Right. No, it's a good point, and I like the aspiration, of some agreed standards of responsible communication. That said, it can't be legislated, at least not in the U.S., just given not only the degree of polarization here, but in a more positive way, we are still quite strict about freedom of speech, and even though that's become a weaponized in the political discourse as well. But I don't see, I see this as something that could be developed on a voluntary basis. But I take the point. It's critically important. I just wish, though, just to sort of connect to another theme here, that we heard uh, more truth telling, if I could say so, from business leaders from corporate America. And I'm talking about the erosion of rule of law and challenges to constitutional democracy in the United States. I'm thinking also of the degradation, I'm sorry to say, of by the current administration of our what I've considered to be sacred security alliances, not least with Canada and our European NATO allies, the whole degradation of what was American leadership I wouldn't say of, but in the international community. And I wish that corporate leaders were more willing, even if they're unwilling for understandable reasons, not to pick a fight with the current occupant of the Oval Office, at least to speak out on these issues, as they did up to leading up to and immediately after the 2020 presidential election, when you had the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers call publicly for peaceful transfer of power, imagining, fearing something like January 6, 2021. And amazingly, in retrospect, on the evening of East Coast time on January 20th, 6, 2021, the National Association of Manufacturers, unbelievably in retrospect, put out a statement urging Vice President Pence to convene the U.S. cabinet invoke the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and remove the then current occupant of the Oval Office from office in the final 2 weeks of his term. Incredible in retrospect. And it's almost, the silence has been deafening in the last 14, 15 months, with rare exceptions on issues like the independence of the Fed. We need a little more uh, guts here, wit and guts, I would say, by corporate leaders to speak out on the rule of law, constitutional democracy, U.S. leadership in the international community, which I believe, at the risk of being naive in the second decade of the 21st century, remain bedrock pillars of the success of American business and the stability and prosperity of the U.S. and global economy. And yet, it's the silence of the lambs in the face of the roar of untamed beasts. I'm sorry to use that kind of
Mhm,
an analogy, but
mhm.
that's where I think we are. And I think that the corporate America needs to understand that the political winds will change. Um, and that they need to get back to a position where they defend their own interests and hopefully values. And if rule of law and constitutional democracy aren't interests, God help them and the rest of us.
Well, you're not going to find me disagreeing with any of that. But what I would say is kind of just appealing to parties to kind of come forward. Um, we can see that's not working, right? We can see that's not working. It should work. It's worked in the past. Um, and it makes me conclude that there's something much more structural that needs to take place here. We need to move beyond kind of trying to make the either the business case or the values case for why it is
Yeah,
things should be this or that. It seems to me that there's a more systemic, structural issue here at stake, which has led to everything from Citizens United in the United States as a, you know, yes, that was a Supreme Court of Canada, a U.S. Supreme Court decision, but how did we get to the U.S. Supreme Court coming to that conclusion?
yeah,
There are years and years and years of U.S. Supreme Court decisions based upon the U.S. Constitution, which one can make an argument had been doing a pretty good job. But now it's almost as if, when you run a particular model for 100,000 times, then suddenly the cracks start showing and then the wheels start falling off. So, is there something much more foundational, structural, institutional here that is at work here so that it's not just about, oh, can we get Trump out of office and, that will solve all our problems
yeah,
because then we'll
yeah,
have good people will come back in. I mean, I would like to believe that. I would like to believe that the whole world will realign on that basis, but I have not a lot of confidence
no,
that that is going to happen. And so I'm seeking from you and from
yeah,
others, I'm seeking what do we do at the same time as we do our very best to keep the water out of the boat that's
yeah.
got big holes in the bottom of it? What are we doing to think about, do we need a better boat, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
exactly. So first, just a couple reactions. It's a great question, a big challenge for all of us. It's a challenge the rest of our lifetimes for some of us. So, in the U.S. political context, and this goes back to a point I've been making a lot for what it's worth recently. If one believes broadly in liberal democracy in its broadest sense, that encompasses much of the political spectrum, left, center, right. Liberal democracy relies on rule of law. It relies on vibrant, unfettered civil society, enabled by freedom of speech and assembly and association on the labor side. But it also depends on a fulcrum, if you will, of responsible political parties of the center right and the center left. I happen to be a person of the center left, not the center right. But I have deeply respected, even if I've frequently disagreed with parties of the center right, whether in the US, where I'm from, or the UK, where I've spent much of my life. But we have lost, we no longer have, I'm sorry to say, a responsible party of the center right in the US. And there's a few people left who embody that. I think of Senator Murkowski of Alaska in the US Senate, who I probably disagree with on 7 out of 10 policy issues, but she stands for rule of law, constitutional democracy. Some of the departing Senator from North Carolina, Tillis, departing Congressman Bacon of Nebraska. I would like to see a rebooting of the Republican Party in the U.S. or replacement by another party, if that's possible, that is a center-right party that believes in rule of law, constitutional democracy, even if it has different views of the size and role of the government relative to the private sector and markets. That's all great. That's legitimate. We can disagree till the cows come home on that. So that's just a massive challenge. But there's another point I want to make here that's both a U.S. domestic point and it resonates in Canada with your extraordinary multicultural diversity there that's reflected in government and civil society and the business world, but it's a global point. And that is one of the most appalling um, elements of the current administration is it's not just the attack on DEI. There have been disagreements, even among those of us who are fierce champions of diversity, over some of the bells and whistles on language and so forth, and we can agree to disagree or whatever on that. But diversity, the degradation, and I have to say it, I hate to say it, but I have to say it, the racist degradation and sexist degradation of diversity is sickening. And we have got to take that on and we've got to overcome it. I don't want to be too political here, but it's just unavoidable. The firing of admiral after admiral, general after general, almost entirely, mostly men and women of color or just women, is just sickening and appalling and incompatible with any understanding I've ever had in my whole life of what the United States of America is, or at least stands for. So we have got to have we have to get back to a sense of common decency here and tolerance, and it's a global issue. We've got to respect and embrace and celebrate and empower diversity. It is our greatest strength as a world, as an international community, and I believe as an American, the greatest strength of our country, despite others saying making awful statements to the contrary. We need to pay more attention to the global majority world, the global South, as some still call it. And this goes for all the issues I've worked on over the years, in human rights, labor rights, anti-corruption, to a lesser extent, climate and environment, which I worked on a lot when I was at Calvert with my team there. But maybe one possible, and this is a handoff, back to you, Kernahan, in terms of middle powers in Canada and Prime Minister Carney's leadership, which I don't doubt. Maybe he read your piece on middle powers, but the point is that one good can come out of this awful second term here is not only a revival of the ideals and aspirations that have made America great, if not exceptional, and that's a whole other argument, but a return to a rebalancing and frankly a reforming and restructuring of how we run the international community. I mean, the permanent five with the US and the UK and France and China and Russia alone having veto power. I mean, this is and calling it anachronistic is being overly polite. It's unfathomable in the a third of the way, a quarter of the way now through the 21st century. We've got to listen to middle powers, to smaller countries, to other regions of the world. We've got to take seriously the climate crisis, overwhelming Pacific Island nations, to just name one obvious example. And maybe one of the good, and this is really the point, back to you, that can come out of what, frankly, in my opinion, is an absolutely awful period, is understanding what's most fundamental, what needs to be restored, what needs to be reformed, what needs to be restructured, what needs to be reimagined for the 21st century. And this horrifying shakeout we've had, I hope can at least have the silver lining of compelling us to think boldly and fundamentally about who we are and how we want to run our country, what kind of an example we want to be in the United States of America, but how the world has to be fundamentally, radically rebalanced in ways that respect and elevate diversity.
Well, I'm actually smiling as you say that because I can imagine a Far Side cartoon where you've got some people and they're completely covered with soot because they've just been burnt to a crisp, and one is saying to the other, surely now we've reached as low as we can possibly go." And then, as you know, and as I know, then we next day opens up and we've gone even lower. But yes, I agree with you. Surely the silver lining is we can all see now how fundamental the reforms need to be. And surely we're being exposed to how anything less than that will not
Yeah,
do. But let me just quickly say that Canada is very fragile. Democracy in Canada is very fragile. A lot of the same sort of underlying conditions, social media, polarization, and so on, are at work in terms of corrosive, eroding work, the misinformation and the disinformation and everything. Democracy at the best of times is a very fragile beast, and it's happening everywhere. So, in a lot of ways, the genie is out of the bottle. So, and we do have the
yeah,
United States to thank for that. But the um, what I would say is that the two ingredients that have gone completely missing now are good faith, which is essential for the operation of the rule of law, that everybody needs to say, I'm putting my trust. That's the second concept, is trust and good faith, and it's missing. And when that's missing, you have to rebuild that up. And you have to rebuild that up, unfortunately, relationship by relationship, transaction by transaction, since we've reduced things now to just a transactional approach. What have you done for me yesterday? Anything earlier than that doesn't count. So, but what I would say is that, and this is something that I have sort of talked about sort of quietly, is there needs to be national communication, national conversations about how can we do things differently. If you don't mind me saying, I don't think it's just the Republican Party that needs to be completely reconfigured. I'm sorry to say, I think they both do. But beyond that, I really think the United States needs to have a national conversation on how do we want to run our
yeah,
country and what needs to change in order to get to how we want to run our country. Canada needs to do the same. And to your point, there needs to be an international
right,
conversation. How do we want the global community to communicate, to come to agreement,
right,
to deal with disagreement, and so on?
right,
I think if there's one good thing, coming back to that idea of two people covered with black and cinder and ashes and so on, one saying to the other, surely we can't get any lower than this, and that's the silver lining. Yeah, I hope that is the case, because frequently I call it regulation by disaster. Frequently, that is the only time when there's a willingness to really stop and consider where we are and to agree to do something different, is when we're at the absolute bottom, whether you're an alcoholic
right.
or you are a country. It's when you're at the absolute bottom. That's the only moment where there's a
Yeah,
brief window, Overton window, if
that's
I can
right.
call it that.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah, wasn't there a
yeah,
saying that the darkest time of night is just
just
before
before dawn.
dawn? The late great Republican Senator John McCain used to say that. Well, I don't know if he came up with it, but just to sort of make a more modest point here that might help, wrap things up in terms of our opening theme of talking about multi-stakeholder um, initiatives and standards. So we've just talked about huge geopolitical as well as domestic political challenges, both in the US and the Canadian context, that are going to be, incredibly difficult to take on, but we've got to do it. But in the meantime, and on a continuing basis, there's so much that we can do, and frankly, we are doing in different ways to defend progress, and to keep moving forward where we can. I'm involved in an effort with the Business and Human Rights Center to research and report major backsliding by the 50 or so biggest US companies on human rights. And it's a mixed picture. There's a lot of companies are staying the course to their credit. Some are sort of quiet quitting by reducing their implementation capacity, their staffing to carry out their policy commitments. Some are actively undermining, disrupting decades of progress. But we're doing this work. We're trying to hang in there on the climate front. I was inspired by and haven't really seen a rerun of what we saw during the first Trump administration, where some of the biggest companies in corporate America, together with big institutional investors, together with the big major environmental NGOs, came together and said, "Okay, you're taking the U.S. out of Paris. We're going to counter by doubling down on our emissions reductions requirements." And they were joined by governors of mostly Democratic states and mayors of big cities and blue and red states alike. And as a result, the damage of Trump taking the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement was mitigated. It was not eliminated, but it was mitigated. It was offset partly. So there's a lot we can do, whether it's on human rights, labor rights, whether it's maintaining diversity in the face of fierce political and cultural opposition, whether it's continuing on climate. God help us if we lose the plot on this climate crisis, as Europeans are sweltering this summer. So there's a lot we can do, and we're not going to restructure the Permanent Five at the UN Security Council in the next year or two. But there's so much that we can and must do with different sectors, different actors, multi-stakeholder coalitions where we can, maintaining the multi-stakeholder standards and keeping and getting companies, investors, civil society in the room with or without certain governments, and trying to defend the international community, trying to maintain the basic funding of the UN, even with all of its problems of legitimacy at the UN Security Council P5 level. So there's so much that we got to do here. Some of it is of meta-historical, geopolitical significance and challenge, but some of it is more within our reach, building on the kinds of initiatives and coalitions where we've found convergence of interests and values over the years. And we've got to do that more than ever now to limit the damage that we're seeing. So I hope that this body of work that so many people around the world have been part of the last 25 or 30 years gives us some hope and some models at the micro level, even as we have to focus on the biggest macro, frankly, meta historical level imaginable.
Agreed. I think we have to hunker down with those who are thinking the same. But I do think that ultimately the solutions, plural, solutions are only going to come from a combination of government, private sector, and civil society,
Yep.
realizing they have common ground and setting aside their many legitimate differences and saying, let's work on the common ground right now,
Yep.
because there's a fire right outside our door here.
Yep.
And so now we are together. We are together in the face of that fire. And well, all I can say is that you and I and others have been trying to create a global multi-stakeholder coalition for the rule of law. And I have been shocked at the inability of major organizations who have the rule of law as their foundational basis for everything that they do. And they will not agree to stand up and work together on that, which to me is just very basic. I continue, because that's just the way I am, and I can see that's where you are, to work towards those sorts of objectives and those sorts of coalitions. And those are stopgaps, for what needs to happen, which is this more fundamental structural reforms that we're talking
Yeah.
about here, national conversations, international conversations. But I know, just in case everybody in the audience here does not know this, I know that you are constantly on a plane going from one doing everything that you can, whether right now it's for the B4 Ukraine coalition, or it's the cotton campaign that you're working on,
Yeah.
or as you say, business and human rights. I know that you're working tirelessly,
Well, thank you.
and
Well,
you need to keep on doing that.
thank you.
But that's still very much down at that
Well, thank
hunkering
you.
down level. We
That's
need
right. Well,
we need
thank
the
you for that.
hands to extend.
So many people are doing this. And I was in Kyiv for the last week of April with Be for Ukraine. We had a big conference of our coalition partners and then a public conference. It was so inspiring to see the courage, the resilience, the determination of Ukrainians, and who are, fighting for their lives, fighting for their freedom, fighting for their independence, fighting for their sovereignty, fighting for their democracy. And it just put, the biggest picture possible, the importance of this work and their example. And I just think of people struggling around the world now, and
Yeah,
with life made so much more difficult by, the collapse of global health funding, or the collapse of climate finance and progress in that respect, and some of the erosion of human rights, and now the threats to democracy in the United States and elsewhere. So we have our work cut out for us. But the good news, and to end on, is that there's so many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world who are committed, who are courageous. And I've just feel really lucky and privileged as an American to, have worked with incredibly courageous people, human rights defenders, people in and out of government and the private sector around the world, doing this work. And now, in my own case, spending more and more time with students at Berkeley, at Oxford, and elsewhere. And the next generation, people you and I are not young. We're not, I hope, long in the tooth, but the reform, the resilience is going to come from younger people. But I just hope that some of the work that many of us have done, some of the standards we've set and models that we've tried to create, can be adapted by those who follow as we rebuild this broken world.
agreed. Agreed. I do think that the attacks on facts, what
Yep.
constitutes facts, is really kind of a fundamental point upon everything else.
Yeah.
Everything else is based on that. You really can't have a discussion with someone if they're constantly bringing misinformation and disinformation to the table
Yep.
and polluting others with those ideas. So that sort of polarization and so on, really, it's very difficult to proceed with constructive solutions
Yeah.
for various different things if there's that sort of backdrop as you try to do that.
Yeah.
So I commend you, Bennett,
Thank you.
for your continued work, tireless work in that regard, and
Thank you.
also for taking the time today
Thank
to
you.
talk on behalf of Toronto Metropolitan University and the CSR Institute in
Thank you.
particular.
Thank you.
Very grateful for you doing that. We're going to have to keep on talking.
Yeah.
We're going to have to keep on working on
Yep.
finding those solutions. And so I wish you continued success in your work, and
Thank you, Kernahan. Thank you so much
keep on
for
talking.
the conversation and convening, and thanks to all those listening, and really, really deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All the
Good luck.
best.
Good luck to us all. Thanks.
Yes. Thanks.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.